When most people think of Adventure Time, they think of the weird and wonderful adventures of two best friends, Finn the human and Jake the dog, in the land of Oo, which is home to all sorts of strange creatures, and perhaps most bizarrely, Finn appears to be the only human. I'm going to try my best not to spoil it for anyone, but basically the most interesting thing about this series is there's a much more substantial story happening in the background that Finn and Jake are barely even involved in at all. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that later, but first of all, any voice actor aficionados may also be aware that Jake is voiced by John DiMaggio, who has had so many roles it would be too time-consuming to list them all here. But perhaps his most famous role being Bender from Futurama, a show about a delivery boy who accidentally gets cryogenically frozen and wakes up in the year 3000. Finn and Jake even appear in the Futurama episode Leela and the Jeanstalk for like 3 seconds.
What time is it? Time for you to shut up!
In the Adventure Time episode Everything's Jake, Jake is magically forced inside of himself where he meets a bunch of characters voiced by Billy West, including several recognisable voices from Futurama.
Now that you're back, how about that $5 you still owe me?
That's it! I'm getting 100 cups of coffee.
Below us are gathered the city's top minds.
But you forgot one thing. Rock crushes scissors. But paper covers rock. And scissors cuts paper. Kif, we have a conundrum.
If Jake leaves, that would mean the utter destruction of our world.
If anyone needs me, I'll be in the Angry Dome.
This Easter egg in of itself is quite obvious, but one thing I only realised after I finished the series is that this crossover choice may have been more deliberate than I first thought. Remember that background story of Adventure Time that I so enticed you with earlier? Well, it concerns the world, and this is the point where I do have to spoil it a bit, so pause the video and skip ahead to the point shown in the description if you don't want to hear this. Right, have you paused it yet? Okay, so for the rest of you, the land of Oo is actually on Earth in a time after a cataclysmic event called the Great Mushroom War, which caused mass extinction. It can even be seen that the Earth has had a huge chunk blown out of it. Not only that, but the fallout from the bombs appears to have started making inanimate objects come to life, at least that's how I understand it, which explains why you have the candy people and such. It's not exactly clear when the war began or ended, but it's implied that it was sometime around the turn of the millennium, and the two characters that were actually around before the war are both approximately 1,000 years old. This would make it safe to assume that Finn and Jake are living somewhere around the year 3000 at the earliest. That year sort of ringing a bell to anyone? Good, let's move on. I think it's safe to assume that Adventure Time and Futurama aren't set in the same time because there's no hole in the earth in any of the Futurama episodes, but that's where I come on to talk about Disenchantment. Disenchantment is a Netflix series created by Matt Groening, who is most famous for creating The Simpsons and also created Futurama, and concerns the adventures of an alcoholic princess called Bean, an elf named Elfo, and a tiny black demon who goes by the name of Lucy in a fantasy-esque setting. The series features voice actors, writers, and producers who have worked on Futurama. My theory is that if Disenchantment is set on Earth and not in some distant planet or in another dimension or in someone's dream, etc., then it's probably set sometime in the future and in the same universe as Futurama, and possibly even Adventure Time, although that link is much harder to prove. In fact, it's a well-established fan theory that Disenchantment and Futurama are set in the same universe.
Let's go already! Let's go already! Bite my shiny metal ass! Bite my shiny metal ass! The human race can bite my shiny metal ass! Bite my shiny metal axe!
Many of the episodes of Disenchantment contain Futurama Easter eggs, most notably Season 2, Episode 9, The Electric Princess.
I guess I'm looking for Farnsworth Boulevard?
In Disenchantment Season 1, Episode 10, Dreamland Falls, Lucy uses a crystal ball to look back in time, and if you look really closely, you'll see Fry, Bender, and Professor Farnsworth from Futurama in their forwards time machine from the Futurama episode The Late Philip J. Fry. This episode will be key in unravelling just how the two series are linked, but first of all, I want to lay out some more evidence that Disenchantment is set in the future and not in the past. First of all, ping pong balls are a thing.
One of Jerry's ping pong balls.
The first ping pong balls were made of celluloid, a substance created in 1871 and therefore could not have existed in the 13th century or whenever the series hints at being set. Secondly, the series also blends elements of steampunk, which pretty much means that if it is set on Earth, it can't be set in the past unless it's some alternate reality. My third clue is that in the first episode of Futurama, when Fry gets accidentally frozen, we see through a time-lapse that New York is destroyed by aliens, and in that time, castles can be seen being built in the background before aliens come and destroy them again. This gives rise to the possibility that Disenchantment could be set near New York during this time period. I would estimate somewhere around the 25th or 26th century. However, this isn't the only time Futurama shows the theme of castles coming back into fashion in the future, so back to the episode The Late Philip J. Fry, where Fry, Bender, and the Professor are testing a time machine that can only go forwards in time. They accidentally shoot themselves 7,000 years into the future, and with no way of going back, decide to keep going forward in time to see if a backwards time machine gets invented at any point. Through a series of blunders, they end up at the end of the world, and with no way of ever returning home, decide to fast forward to the end of the universe while kicking back with some beers. They find out that time is actually cyclical, as a second Big Bang gives birth to an identical universe, and they're able to travel back to their old lives by keep shooting forward, but they overshoot again and end up having to go around a second time. Due to the cyclical nature of this timeline, and the fact that castles come up several times during their future travels, it can't actually be determined when Disenchantment is set in relation to Futurama, whether it's a few hundred years before or perhaps thousands of years later. The crystal ball looks back, but a circular timeline means that if you go back far enough, you will end up in the future at some point. That's where my Adventure Time theory comes in. There is a location in Disenchantment called the Edge of the World, which can be seen in several episodes. One soldier even comments that it looks more like a gentle incline before falling to his death. It could be inferred that the edge of the world isn't the edge of the world at all. As much as flat earth theory has become quite mainstream for some bizarre reason, I don't think Matt Groening would dignify this by making his world flat. What if instead the world has had a continent-sized hole blown in it, just like in Adventure Time? One could go even further with this speculation and ask, what if the two series are actually set in the same universe? Maybe the edge of the world is just the edge of this giant crater where you can't see the horizon. If we factor in my crater theory and go on the somewhat tenuous notion that the crater implies that Disenchantment and Adventure Time are in fact set in the same universe, then both have to take place after Futurama, since there's no evidence of a crater being visible anywhere in that. I said Adventure Time would have to take place around the year 3000 at the earliest, but there's actually no later limit, since I don't think it's actually specified when the Great Mushroom War happened. Although they do establish in the episode Simon and Marcy the existence of TV shows like Cheers, which means it would have to at least be after 1982. And in the same episode, Simon uses the phrase BRB, which I don't think was a saying in the 80s. I really wouldn't know. My point is that it's likely that the Great Mushroom War started much later than 1982. It's impossible to say for sure whether Adventure Time is set in the same universe as Disenchantment and Futurama, and I'm probably not the first person to interpret the edge of the world as being a giant crater, but it's human nature to look for patterns even if they are coincidental. I will assert at the very least that I think Disenchantment is post-Futurama and not pre. It is possible that the series creators do have plans to explain all this as the series concludes, as at time of writing, Disenchantment is only 3 seasons in and definitely not finished. But then again, maybe they won't feel the need to explain it to us. Maybe sometimes certain things are best left a mystery.